The 1994 National Saloon Car Cup saw revisions to the engine capacities in some classes and a whole host of new drivers ready to do battle in what promised to be a very competitive season. It kicked off at Silverstone on the national circuit in March with the Australian driver Charlie Cox on pole position, Graham Coombs alongside him and David Yates starting third on the grid. A down-on-power Cox made a relatively slow start, and it was Yates who barrelled up on the outside line trying to snatch the lead as they went into Cox. It didn't quite work though. The Australian held on, with Yates and Coombs battling it out side by side. Out of Cox as the Australian Charlie Cox ran wide, Yates was up alongside him, and the Cheshire driver was through. Cox and Coombs fell out towards the end of the lap, but eventually leading to a punctured tyre for the bookmaker Graham Coombs. A very sideways Cox meanwhile pressed on in pursuit of Yates. Ex-Thunder Saloon driver Hugh Marshall was ahead of Peter Morss. Morss in Class C with his Vauxhall Astra, a rather sideways Astra at that. One harmless spin later, he was able to rejoin, as then, being delayed by the traffic, Yates was overtaken by Cox in dramatic fashion. The two touched, it knocked Yates round, and Cox, having almost come to a standstill himself, was able to move through and snatch the lead. And so Charlie Cox it was who came through, lapping more of the slower cars, to take victory number one of the season. It had been a long, hard battle, and it promised to be the shape of things to come for the rest of '94. Cheshire driver David Yates battled his way back up to second place, but was far from happy about all that contact that had gone on during the course of the Silverstone race. He was pleased nonetheless to have battled up to second. Donington for round two had qualifying in hail, rain and snow, and Donington looked more like a stage of the RAC rally than a racing circuit. It put Jeff Kimber-Smith's Sapphire Cosworth onto pole position and Simon Harrison's Honda Civic on row two. It left people like David Yates and Charlie Cox with quite a lot of work to do as they had to battle their way up from lowly grid positions. Colin Wells, the man who was to go on to dominate Class B, the up to 2.9 litre class with his BMW M3, was in sparkling form as ever. Andy Middlehurst had his Nissan Skyline GTR running very well here at Donington. He too had a lowly grid position because of the weather and was soon battling his way past the Hondas. Former National Hunt jockey David Pitcher had possibly the biggest accident of the year coming out of the old hairpin when his Astra went off in astronomical fashion. Thankfully he was okay, and the car had to be reshelled before he could come out and play later in the season. In Hondaland, Stephen Warburton and Simon Harrison, the two teammates, fell out. And eventually, the red flags came out as well to stop the race. By this stage, there were cars littering the circuit. It had been a fairly destructive part one to the race at Donington. Graham Coombs was now in the lead from David Yates. There was going to be a battle on aggregate times in part two. And then Graham Coombs had a very big fright. A valve had been ripped out of the tyre deflated, and as he came down through the Craner curves, the car went off across the very slippery grass, and that was Coombs out of the race. All this left David Yates in the lead. He came through Goddard's up to the checkered flag to even the score between him and Cox, 1-1. Class B went the way of Colin Wells, the Honda battled to Simon Harrison, and at Silverstone for round three, Cox was back in the winner's circle, scoring victory from regular class winners Colin Wells and Don Kettleborough, among others. That took us on to Alton Park for round four. Charlie Cox took pole position by an amazing margin, and not surprisingly led away from the rolling start first into Old Hall. David Yates had started third on the grid and was eager to do well here at Alton, his home circuit, and with a number of guests here to watch him. On the opening laps, though, he had a lot of work to do to try and catch up with race leader Cox. Charlie Campbell, the Scotsman, went off at Knickerbrook up the escape road and took with him some marker tyres. Neatly parking by the side of the road, he reversed to get rid of them and set off, leaving the marshals with a bit of work to do to remove all the tyres. On the last of the 12 laps, Cox had been caught by Yates. The turbo had gone on Cox's Escort. He was now effectively driving a 2-litre RS 2000. Down to Lodge Corner for the final time, Yates had a look on the outside. Surely that was never going to work. It didn't, but then as they came out of Lodge up Deer Leap, the fact that Yates' car had some power and Cox's didn't certainly told. They flashed across the line with David Yates just winning by 0.06 of a second. It was an incredible finish. Mallory Park was an amazing race as well. It was in the wet, and only Michael Woodcock was able to make the correct tyre choice. Although it was wet early on, the circuit was drying. He was on slicks. Simon Major was on the grass and in the tyre barrier. Despite this major moment, Simon was able to recover and carry on. Up front, though, the leaders were finding themselves in major trouble with their overheating tyres. Peter Morss, though, lucky here not to roll as he spun coming out of the Devil's Elbow. And so Michael Woodcock it was with a Dave Brady prepared car who went on to win his first Group N victory of the season. A fortnight later, the cars were back at Alton Park in Cheshire. Charlie Cox the winner there, and Then it was time for the jewel in the crown of Group N racing. Snetterton in Norfolk is the home of the Wilhite 24 Hours, the 1994 event, the 15th in the series. The entry may not quite be as large as it used to be, but still it was an entry of great quality for 1994. On board with the BMW M3 of Alistair Davidson, ready for the start of 24 Hours at Snetterton. The pace car in the pits, the green lights came on and off they set. It was a battle down to the first corner between Del Delaron with the Maxted's Escort and number 5, a very able crew of Robin Rex, Rob Coates, Ben Edwards and Graham Coombs, all of them with some tin-top experience. 5 classes in the Wilhite 24 Hours, 4 of them based on engine size, and also the invitation class, which allowed in a BMW M3 crewed by a team of Germans, production saloon specification Honda Preludes, as well as Metros and a road saloon Ford Capri, bringing a touch of nostalgia to this great event. Early on lap 1, through into the lead went the Rex Escort. Already some drivers were starting to settle into their race pace. Class B was being headed by the Alistair Davidson M3, and flying up through the order was Charlie Cox at the wheel of his new Ford Escort. We're on board with the Vauxhall Astra, driven by Paul Michael, David O'Dell and Andy Clarkin, and that was expected to do well in the 1600 to 2 litre class. Third in the opening stages, the Ford Sapphire, driven by Jeff Kimber-Smith and Andy Dawson, the team electing to do the event with just 2 drivers. And Charlie Cox, with the black Carphone Warehouse Escort, was still charging his way up through the field. He had now split the Hondas, and they too were cars expected to do well overall. Pit stop time, refuelling and tyres needed. Into the pits comes Cox with the Escort. Time for the team to busy themselves around the Escort. The belt's undone, time for a driver change, as out got Charlie Cox and Rob Gravitt prepared to take over. Gravitt had won this event in 1987, and as he prepared to take the Escort back on the circuit, Charlie Cox and co-driver Paul Goldstein discussed tactics.
I was alright for the first half hour, then the drink got warm. I had to come in. I had only pitted because the drinks were hot.
So the champagne bubbled up today and got a bit frothy, did it?
You know what it's like, it's sour when it's hot. It's no good at all.
Dramas though early on for the number 5 Escort, the Rex, Coates, Edwards and Coombs car in trouble. It had a fuel pump drama all the way through the event. As that headed for the pits, other teams were now worrying about dinner. Action still hot on the circuit though, as back into the race as the evening wore on had come the number 5 Escort Cosworth. But still the car to beat was the Maxted's Escort, running in Group N for the first time. This car had been the prototype for the ill-fated Escort Cosworth series, but was still being challenged hard by the number 18 BMW of Alistair Davidson, Simon Durden and Robert Nern. That had moved into the lead of Class B as a result of the Colin Wells M3 being crashed by co-driver John Wilcox. In Class D, the number 31 Honda was leading there. James Kay, Roland Dane and Robin Brundle, the drivers, being pushed hard by junior drivers Simon Harrison, Dan Little and Steve Warburton in number 32. And this, the remains of the Wells car. John Wilcox had been driving it when it went off the road near the S's, and it had done a great deal of damage. The car would rejoin and was then troubled by a throttle difficulty. And so, after 6 hours of racing, the Delaron Escort Cosworth led the Kuroki Arakawa and Briggs Honda Civic. Third was the similar car of Simon Harrison, with Roland Dane's Honda in 4th. In the early evening, the spectators' attentions turned towards the rock band playing in the background, and then, as night came, the drivers were able to take part in a form of motorsport they seldom enjoy, nighttime racing. This one of the major features for the competitors of the Wilhite 24 Hours, and amazingly, the entire field was still running. The German BMW, crewed by Manfred Anspahn, Dieter Steinlein, Alfred Hilger and Dieter Brannauer, was going well. Behind it in trouble, though, the Vauxhall Astra of Andy Clarkin, Paul Michael and David O'Dell, as that ran out of road. Alistair Davidson, with his BMW M3, was comfortably leading Class B, the 2 litre to 2.9 litre class. He had an easier time of it now, especially after the dramas that had befallen the Colin Wells, Steve Guglielmi, John Wilcox BMW earlier in the race. For now, all Davidson and co-drivers Robert Nern and Simon Durden had to do was keep out of trouble and avoid the very fleet Honda Civics. The number 32 car of Simon Harrison, Dan Little and Steve Warburton was not only leading Class D, but was an amazing second overall. It was also proving to be a real problem to overtake for the 2.3-litre BMW. The field battled on all through the night. Still there were no retirements, and still in the lead was the number 4 Escort Cosworth, the Delaron, Nikita Reggiani, Andrew Jeffrey and James Prokofsky driven car. This Honda Civic was second. Harrison, Liddell and Warburton the drivers, although they were some 10 laps adrift of the leaders. The Honda pit stops were running like clockwork. They were almost boring. A driver change, fuel added and new tyres when necessary. Mardi Gras boss Martin Shaw ushered the car back out of the pits onto the circuit. Class C had been far more open. The total-backed Astra doing well. Also, so was the Escort RS 2000 of Jim Smith, Mike Hellman, Ian Guest, and the Colin Davids, Taylan Frankie, Peter Morss Vauxhall Astra. David O'Dell and Paul Michael, the regular drivers of the total Astra, had to give best to a Honda coming into Russell, but they were concerned about getting to the finish. They were keeping out of trouble and allowing the quicker cars to go past. Driveshaft problems and fuel pump problems had been the major dramas for the teams during the course of the race thus far, but they were all still able to battle through into the second day. As dawn broke over Snatterton, people were amazed to find that not only were the Escort Cosworth still running, they were still leading. In the invitation class, the Honda Prelude of Trevor and Grant Elliott and Rod Burley had been going well, although disaster was just around the corner for the Honda team. Still, the reliable BMW M3s pressed on, Class B headed by the Davidson car. As morning broke, the teams were all looking tremendously weary, everybody having had their fair share of dramas through the event, and none more so than the number 24 Astra that was leading Class C. Peter Morss, Taylan Frankie and Colin Davids, the driver. Davids in the blue overalls had been driving it when a wheel parted company at the S's, pitching him off the road in a big way. Amazingly, the team would have the car running before too long, although a driveshaft problem gave them dramas later. Another car that had been doing well after an earlier fuel pump drama was the number 7 Nissan Skyline, driven by Andy Middlehurst and Frank Greenway, along with Knut Jensen and Hans Kolbe. And then came the first retirement of the event. The number 41 Honda Prelude of Trevor and Grant Elliott and Rod Burley was out of the race. After 16 hours, the first retirement had been witnessed, a broken engine on the Prelude, time for the drivers to pack away the tent and head for home. Still going well was the Ford Capri. The number 50 car, driven by Alex Rogan, Tony Brass and Simon Light, had been soldiering on, bringing a touch of nostalgia to this event. Also, driving like a man possessed had been Colin Wells. He, along with co-drivers Steve Guglielmi and John Wilcox, had hustled the BMW M3 back up the order. They were now 11th, and despite drivers running at a pre-arranged pace, they were still dramas. Witness the spin by the number 5 Escort over at Sea Corner. Up came the yellow flags, cars dodging it left, right and centre. This was not what the team wanted. They'd had to change the fuel pump on that car earlier in the race, and it had dropped them a long way down the field. 21st place in the early hours of the morning for the number 5 Escort. Still leading though, the number 4 car. Kevin Maxted, the team manager, looking on and biting his fingernails, hoping that the car would make it to the finish. Rob Gravitt had now taken over the number 1 Escort of Charlie Cox, Guy Holmes and Paul Goldstein, and Gravitt had a lot of work to do to give it a good result. The team had had to change the diff on the car in order to keep it in the race, but as Gravitt came past the pits, he lost all drive. He looked down, the car coasted past the pits, and there was an audible groan from the number 1 team. With just 23 minutes to go before the end of the event, team manager Ian Cross officially retired the car. Cruel luck, after it had been one of the fastest Escorts all weekend. Still going well, however, was the number 6 Ford Sapphire, driven by Jeff Kimber-Smith and Andy Dawson. That was now 5th overall, while fortunes in Class C had swung the way of Paul Michael, David O'Dell and Andy Clarkin, mainly as a result of the driveshaft dramas for others. The Cox team was still working on the car, even though it wouldn't return to the circuit. The spectators looked on as the battles continued. Back in the race had come number 24. That was the Astra that had lost a wheel when Colin Davids was driving it. It had now moved up to 2nd in Class C behind the O'Dell Michael car. They were separated though by 6 laps, and a change didn't look as though it was on the cards. Still going well in the invitation class was the Ford Capri of Alex Rogan. On target for a win in Class B was the BMW M3 of Alistair Davidson, Rob Nern and Simon Durden. Behind them on the road and moving up to 11th overall, Andy Middlehurst's Nissan Skyline. But this was the car that had dominated the race. It had led on the hour every hour. It had been driven by Del Delaron, James Prokowski, Andrew Jeffrey and Nikita Reggiani, the Maltese driver, and it had been run by Kevin Maxted. The number 4 Ford Escort Cosworth was nearly home as the winner of the 1994 Wilhar 24 Hours. Its pace though was so rapid, as it crossed the line, it had to go on to another lap. The clock ticked away, nearing 3 p.m. all the time, and this was the car in third place. The number 33 Honda had been driven by the two Japanese experts Kenji Kuroki and Masahiko Arakawa with Warren Briggs. They would finish third as the checkered flag came out, and everyone cheered as the number 4 Escort came home the winner. A delighted crew of Del Delaron, Nikita Reggiani, Andrew Jeffrey and James Prokowski won the 1994 Wilhar 24 Hours. Victory in Class C went to Paul Michael, David Odell and Andy Clarkin, the delighted team coming home as class winners, 9th overall. 18 of the 22 crews made it home as finishers, and then they headed to the prize giving, where everybody was very appreciative of the efforts of the drivers. 2nd overall and winners of Class D, Simon Harrison, Dan Liddell and Stephen Warburton with the Honda Civic. They'd finished 10 laps adrift of the winners, but it had been a fine effort. The biggest cheer of all was reserved for the winners. 2 more one-hour races followed the Wilhar. The first at Brands Hatch was won by Cox and Rob Gravitt. The second at Donington Park was won by Graham Coombs and Kurt Luby. At Pembrey in August, Coombs yet again had problems. The wheel had worked its way loose, and Graham had a big moment in the Rock Turf Escort coming towards Honda Curve. That was him out of the race, and Charlie Cox was in the pits with a down on power engine once again. Team manager Ian Cross waved him away, but a frustrated Australian had a lot of work to do. He was now effectively a lap down. Off there goes Simon Harrison, who was leading Class D and the championship overall. The race was won by David Yates with his newly rebuilt Escort, having been demolished in testing at Mallory Park back in May. From Pembrey, it was on to Castle Combe, where Graham Coombs won the race and Charlie Cox won Class A in the championship battle. Cox also won at his favourite circuit, Thruxton, in the middle of September. The Thames Ford Escort going extremely well here, but in the championship it was now a battle between Stephen Warburton and Simon Harrison. It would be decided in murky and gloomy conditions at Silverstone on the full Grand Prix circuit in October. The front row was David Yates on pole and Charlie Cox alongside him. Michael Woodcock on the second row of the grid, along with Peter Clark, the rallyman returning to the series. Yates made a bad start, his Escort immediately in trouble. Life was very difficult indeed for all the drivers. It was dark, it was wet and it was slippery. Peter Clark led as they came into Stowe for the first time, where it all went wrong for Cox behind him. He locked up, kissed the tyre barrier, and thanks to four-wheel drive was able to rejoin, but down in 16th place. A handful of Australian expletives were used at the end of the lap, and Cox had to battle his way up through the field. Clark led from Woodcock and Yates, with Andy Middlehurst in 4th place, and in 5th now Del Delaron, the Wilhar winner, out in a sprint race for the first time. Mike Jordan was 2nd in Class B, just ahead of Jeff Kimber-Smith. Class B as ever being led by Colin Wells, who'd sewn that element of the championship up by now. Into the pits came David Yates. Not a good day for the high mark driver, who was able though to rejoin later in the race, but up front Peter Clark had a seemingly unassailable lead. Further back there was a tremendous battle between Graham Coombs and Michael Woodcock, Coombs slithering his way through on the inside at Stowe in a neat manoeuvre. They continued to battle, but all the time Coombs was able to draw ever so slightly closer to Peter Clark. Further back, Don Kettleborough as ever was leading Class C, having been really the only man to support it all season long. Class D was as close as ever, with Harrison, Warburton and Dan Liddell, the three teammates, battling. Class B was going the way of Colin Wells, and Class C in the championship will be won by Peter Morss. Stephen Warburton here was doing well in the race, but was only on target for 2nd place in the championship overall. At the front though, the race had suddenly come alive. Coombs had shaken off the advances of Woodcock and was now up into the lead. Peter Clark though was right with him, and as Coombs ran wide at Copse, Clark came back through to take his lead over once again. It seemed to sum up Graham Coombs' season, quick but misfortune getting in the way. David Odell with the total quartz Astra was out of the race, and further back the Hondas came through, the championship going the way of Simon Harrison. That made it 2 in a row for Team Castrol Honda. Last year, James Thompson had won. He's moved on to touring cars. Will Simon Harrison be able to do the same? And so, with the championship resolved, it was on to Brands Hatch for the final sprint race of the season. The overall positions now to be decided. David Yates had led early on, but then slipped back through the field. Charlie Cox was in trouble once again, and it looks as though Graham Coombs will be able to take a trouble-free win. He was, the good live car coming home first, with the Thames Ford and Highmark Escort behind. Simon Harrison won the 1994 National Saloon Car Cup with Stephen Warburton and Dan Liddell second and third. Charlie Cox was fourth and won Class A, Peter Morss fifth winning Class C, and Colin Wells the Class B winner, sixth overall.